Commemoration of Alice Murray, who I think has a pretty good claim to be the first serious economic historian of Ireland. You might have thought it was George O'Brien. I think that's probably how we typically think of the thing. You know, there was George O'Brien's nationalist thesis, and then there's Louis' revisionist antithesis, and then there's the cleometric synthesis of Cormac and Joel Mulcair. But actually, Alice Murray beat George O'Brien to it by 10 years or more. And in fact, in her book, a lot of his themes emerge very clearly. So like George O'Brien, she feels that the commercial, by which she means tariff, trade policy of Britain, of England, Britain, the UK, have a lot to, can help explain a lot of Ireland's underdevelopment, I suppose. There's this reference here to the mass of people being thrown on the land because they weren't industrialising. You know, so that was the big problem as people saw it in 1900. You know, why hadn't we industrialised? And like O'Brien, Alice Murray thought that had a lot to do with British trade policy. So like O'Brien, she felt that the English mercantilist legislation of the 17th and 18th centuries had done a lot of harm to Irish export industries. You know, she says there, you know, Ireland suffered, you know, more than other parts of the British Empire at that time. She's now careful, because she's a decent historian, to put it into some sort of broader context. So it's not that the British were uniquely wicked or anything. This was a mercantilist period. Everybody was at it. Everybody was intensely materialistic. Everybody was intensely nationalistic. And that's why the British behaved the way they did. But it had bad consequences for Ireland, she felt. So that was the mercantilist period, hadn't done us any good. The Cattle Acts, you know, the Woolen Acts, all of this kind of thing. But then when you come on to the 19th century and the period of free trade, again, you know, the British just can't win. They then had free trade, but that wasn't any good for us either, because at that stage, you know, our industries had been wiped out, and how could you possibly develop subjected to the full commercial might of Lancashire being vented into your national market? So we couldn't have the sorts of tariff policies that, say, the Germans and the, you know, many other continentals had in the late 19th century. So, and that's in O'Brien also, you know. So really, she really is prefiguring a lot of what George O'Brien had to say, and that's the first thing I wanted to say today. I was delighted when I looked at her book. Of course, I did look at her book, and I found the preface by William Hewins, who was the first director of the London School of Economics. And as you can see, Hewins also is not a fan of the impact of free trade on Ireland. So he says, you know, it was based on an even narrower conception of English interests it was even worse than the mercantile system. You know, and, you know, I mean, Ireland is a standing proof that the generalisation that free trade is a magic wand, and if you wave it, you'll be rich. Well, that's not the way the world works. Now, I was pleased about this because Hewins, number one, and number two, the date, 30th September 1903, both remind us that Alice Murray was writing about British commercial history at a time when trade policy was the dominant theme in British politics. Britain had been a free trading country since 1846. If ever a Frenchman tries to convince you differently on the grounds that the British tariffed imports of French wine, you may safely disregard them. Those tariffs were just the international equivalent of domestic excise taxes on beer and spirits, and it was just more efficient to tax things like, you know, wine or tea or sugar or tobacco at the border rather than via domestic excise duty. So has it been a free trade country? There was a broad consensus in favour of free trade. I mean, the Liberals, of course, were in favour of free trade. The working classes, insofar as they counted, were very much in favour of free trade because it meant cheap food. Many Conservatives were also in favour of free trade, but some of them had always been sceptical. You know, ever since, you know, Peel's turn to free trade split the party, and so on. And things came to a head in 1903 because of this fellow, Joseph Chamberlain, who was the colonial secretary and who was a great believer in the destiny of the white Anglo-Saxon nation. You know, he was a proper imperialist, you know, and he could see that Britain was on the slide relative to Germany, relative to the United States. It risks no longer having a place at the top table, and so on. And so he felt that greater integration within the empire was the way to counteract that. And like Jean Monnet, in a later time, in a different context, he felt that the way to get greater imperial political togetherness was to have some sort of a preferential trade agreement. Not a mad idea. It worked for Europe, after all, after World War II. But there was a problem, which is you can't really treat imports from Canada or Australia especially favourably if you're letting everybody's goods into your country duty-free. And so what you needed to do, in George Dangerfield's words, was to erect a tariff wall around the British market for the sole purpose of battering holes through it, through which Australian and New Zealand and Canadian goods could pass duty-free. And there was an even bigger problem, which was that the Dominions, their chief exports to Britain were largely foodstuffs. And so, in fact, Chamberlain's imperial preference scheme would have required erecting tariffs on imports of wheat and meat from the United States and continental Europe. And that was something that was anathema to many people at the time. And so there was a ferocious row about all of this. And our friend Humans was centrally involved in this row because he started writing in June, I think, of 1903, a series of newspaper columns in the Times under the pseudonym An Economist. He was certainly going to play the game of saying, I speak with the authority of economics. There was great fascination in London at the time about who an economist was. Was it Ashley? The economic historians were largely suspected of being in this camp, and so was it Ashley? Was it Cunningham? Marshall knew and was teasing Luigi Brentano in a series of letters. You must guess again. You've almost gone through them all, and so on. But he never gave it up anyway. As you can see in these articles, he says, things, every civilized country has pursued a rigorous policy of protection, for the greater part of its history, and then, well, maybe, we're, more advanced than them, and so maybe for us free imports are the best policy, but, things change, and maybe we might be required to pursue a policy of protectionism in the future again. And he goes on in this kind of vein, and he really gets up the noses of the neoclassical economists of the time, with the result that, I don't know if this is the first group petition on the part of academic economists trying to influence policy. It was just as successful as all of the rest of them were. And there's a Trinity connection here, by the way, because the ringleader of this, as far as we know, he was certainly the person who drafted the letter, most of the letter, and he was the person who sent around letters to other people saying, would you ever sign up, was none other than Francis Edgeworth. And again, if any Englishman would ever have you believe that Edgeworth only spent a year in this university, you can safely disregard that also, because thanks to a recent biography of his, we know that he spent all 4 years here and did his degree exams here as well. So he's definitely one of ours. These professors were wading into a political minefield, but they also play the authority game. So they say we have our opinions on certain matters of more or less technical character, and so that's what they were going to talk about, matters on which they could presumably speak with authority. And as you can see there, I've just highlighted some of the names. So we have Alfred Marshall, who's a bit half-hearted about signing up to a group thing. There's Pigou, there's Edward Cannon, who Edgeworth, and so on, Bowley. So lots of well-known names on that list. And it absolutely infuriated the Chamberlainians and the tariff reformers. This is Leo Amory, who's, I suppose, better known for sticking the knife into Joseph Chamberlain's son Neville in the House of Commons in 1940, and a good thing it was that he did that too. But he was a committed Chamberlainian, and so you can see there, I received a severe shock, and this type of thing. He talks about the preface to the thing. It's pontifical in tone and vigorous, almost hysterical in expression, Judging by internal evidence, it's probably the work of a single author, whom for convenience we may call X. By the way, there was an awful lot of pontifical language in the correspondence to the Times. Since the question was whether these economists spoke with authority, the tariff reformers very often use this word pontifical, or they're speaking ex cathedra, so they were appealing to the sensitivities of your typical Times reader of the day. Sometimes they compared them to dervishes, so it wasn't just Rome that got a kicking. They were sort of Catholic in their anti-Catholicism, or whatever you'd say. Anyway, yes, this is Hewins now writing under his own name. And you can see here, so it's a letter to the Times, and you can see here he talks very much about this issue of authority, which is sort of interesting because, and there's a famous paper by Coates, who's a historian of thought, talking about this and what did it do to the authority of the professional economists of the time and so on. Yeah, and you can see here he doesn't accuse Professor Edgeworth of any discourtesy, but they really dislike the idea that you would say economics says this, And actually, the neoclassical economists were on slightly tricky ground here because they were themselves saying we dispute the authority of the classical economists, because they were obviously revolutionizing the system as well. So Stanley Jevons, for example, had talked a lot about how it's not a dead subject, how we always have new ideas. When the world changes, we change our ideas and so on. So anyway, Hewins here is talking about authority and saying we must not lay too much weight on it. And so I was again very pleased to see in his preface to Alice Murray that he says, you must take this work seriously because it's received the approval of such high authorities as Robert Giffen and Charles Bastable, another Trinity name, and who was one of the signatories indeed to that letter. So when it was academic matters that were at stake, Hewins, felt that fair enough, then we can appeal to authority. All of which is, I suppose, a very roundabout way of saying that this was a time when people got very upset about trade policy. And they got upset about trade policy because Britain was going through a time that maybe resonates with us today. So this is taken from one of an economist, aka Hewins's, articles. It's a graph showing British exports, and they're growing vigorously and virile manner. I'm sure you would have thought, it's a very Victorian way, through this period. And then you can see it sort of tails off. It's rather desultory by the time you get to the late 19th century. Meanwhile, the German export figures are looking extremely vigorous, you see. And so there was something to be worried about. So they were all very worried, and they were already aware of the fact that the Germans were overtaking them in various manufacturing sectors, that the Americans were overtaking them in various manufacturing sectors. So there was economic convergence, such as we've been experiencing over the last several decades, which is good, of course, because it's good if poorer countries catch up on richer countries, but it can make richer countries feel a little bit insecure. So diminished giant syndrome is a phrase that Jagdish Bhagwati and Doug Irwin have used to describe both this period of British history and America in the 1980s. Actually, because they were worried about Japan in those days, but they're even more diminished, I would say, and even more worried maybe nowadays, So, and there are certain things, tropes that you can sort of see coming through in these different contexts. So, the Germans and the Americans, they had protected their markets. They had industrialized behind tariff barriers. It worked for them. This is unfair competition. They're doing industrial policy. Why should we be naive and continue with free trade? Should we not retaliate? Was one of the things that the Chamberlains talked about. You can sort of see the analogy there as well. And of course, where you have shifts in relative plenty or prosperity, you have shifts in relative power. And where you have shifts in relative power, you have danger, for geopolitical stability. And people were very concerned about that. Also, they were concerned about, for example, supply chains. And we know that one of the things that this gives rise to is this naval arms race, which is very much a feature of the scene, as between Britain and Germany. There's a great book by Avner Offer that talks about this. So the Brits had always had a supply chain issue, but they had the right industrial policy, which is to have the biggest navy in the world, so you can buy from wherever you want. Then the Germans industrialize, become dependent on imported food and raw materials. They then want a navy also, but you can't have two countries with the biggest navy in the world. And so that's problematic, And again, some of these issues resonate with us today. All right, so what about today? There's a world that's just vanished. It comes in two bits. There's the bit until 1980, when trade liberalisation was was impressive, but it was largely Western. It was under the GATT, but there was the Cold War. The Chinese were doing their own thing. The colonies were decolonizing and protecting and so on. So, but it was the Atlantic economy was liberalizing. It was a period where it made sense to say that capitalism and democracy went hand in hand, because the West was capitalistic and democratic and the East was not, and so you get books with titles like this. Now, of course, capitalism didn't arise in democracies, so we've a little bit of historical perspective. It's a very odd kind of a thing to suggest go together, but that's how people thought then. Since 1980, the end of the Cold War, it's all geopolitics really. China's opening, worldwide globalization, coinciding with a new conventional wisdom about what the relative respective roles of the state and the market should be, which I think is something that maybe now we're clearly beginning to rethink. And it was a period where sort of capitalism came home, if you like, to the the autocracies of China. So President Xi being like the Sun King of France or something. They kind of are both using capitalism to make themselves and their polities richer and more powerful, and protecting it in various ways. So that's the world that has just vanished. I like to bookend these two quotes. So this is the sort of the summit of 1990s naivete. You would say now. You would have said optimism back then. It's Bill Clinton. Should we allow the Chinese into the WTO? If we do, then we won't be able to discriminate them as regards trade policy anymore. And that will mean that we have one less lever to use against them, because they've been using this lever of, will we extend to them non-discriminatory trade policies? And there'll be a debate in the Congress every year. We don't like your human rights policies, and you get something out of them. Well, that all left. And you can see there that he's hinting. He's not quite saying it, but he's sort of hinting that isn't it quite likely that they will become democratic? Because markets, market freedoms and political freedoms, they go hand in hand. If anything, I think you would have said that the West has become less democratic since this event, but that's another story. And I mean, then this is the obvious bookend to that, isn't it? It's Mark Carney's now famous statement in Davos just a few weeks ago. All right. So we're now in a new age that looks a little bit mercantilistic in various ways, I would say. So first of all, I mean, mercantilism is all about war, and you don't understand mercantilism if you don't understand that war was the natural state of affairs. And so all policies, including economic policies, were erected with that in mind. So a lot of the things that we think of as crazy, maybe made sense in the context of war economies. And we're clearly there again. So there's a focus on national power. We have trade being weaponized pretty clearly by the Americans to achieve these grander goals. You have industrial policy, which is strategically motivated. Industrial policy is very often strategically motivated. There's a long, long history of this. We have protection, we have disregard for international rules, and we have Trump's rather peculiar obsession with bilateral trade imbalances, which is quite a mercantilistic thing, I suppose. So there are some things about this that are surprising, to get onto the topic of my lecture, and some things that are less surprising. So the fact that the Americans have become protectionist again is maybe not that surprising. Now, it's a very dramatic shift. This is the average tariff, and you can see that's what happened last year. It puts them not quite where they were at the peak of the Great Depression, but it puts them sort of squarely back in. Actually, you can see for most of the 19th century, they were more protectionist than they were today. The Americans were always protectionist. And maybe we're just going back to, maybe this is just a new normal, in the same way that a return to a world governed by war and fears about war is just a new normal. We'll have to see whether that's the case or not. But I especially don't think this is surprising because of the processes that have been undergoing for the last sort of 30, 40, 50 years. And I'll make a historical analogy. So this is a graph from a paper by Nick Harley. It shows freight rates, costs of transporting stuff by sea into Britain. You're supposed to believe the British index and not the North's index, which is a suspiciously straight line. So, and I could say more about that, but I won't. What you can see is that it bops around and then it drops like a rock. And this is sort of steamships, essentially. And, we also have railroads, which are actually just as important, and probably more important than steamships, because you couldn't have got the wheat from Kansas to Britain if you hadn't gotten it to New York, first of all. Okay, so we have transport cost declines, and what this does is it integrates the Americas that have lots of cheap land and not very many expensive workers, and the Europeans who have not lots of workers and they're relatively cheap and not much land and it's relatively expensive. And what happens is, as the American grain comes in, it's going to put land rents under pressure in Europe, yes. On the other hand, the Europeans are going to be exporting manufactured goods back to America, and that's going to create jobs in factories, all right? And so what you can see is, but it's going to be the opposite in America. So in America, their food prices are going up because they're shipping the stuff to Europe, you know? And so that's great for land values. But their workers are maybe suffering from competition from Europeans, both in terms of immigration and in terms of trade. And so what you see in America and Australia and Argentina is workers' relative position, relative in society to landowners, is declining during this period. It's the ratio of the income of the worker to the income of the landowner, and the workers are losing out. The landowners are gaining in relative terms, you know, because of these trade flows. And if you look at, in Europe, it's the exact opposite, you know. In Europe, what you have is the workers are gaining in relative terms vis-a-vis the landowners, you know. So the landowners are the ones who are losing, relatively speaking, in Europe. And, you know, these are, you know, they're moving in different directions. That's interesting. You know, you spent a lot of time back in the 1990s trying to link these changes in income distribution to, for example, these declining transport costs, and we did so to our satisfaction. Well, it was a long time ago. The standards of publication have probably changed. But anyway, I do believe the story. And the bottom line is, you know, when powerful people find that their incomes are being eroded, which is what was true of landowners in Europe at this time, they're going to do something about it, you know. If they're in a democracy, and even if they're not in a democracy, they're going to do something about it if they have the political power. And so what you see in Europe is, you know, there'd been a phase, 20, 30-year phase of trade liberalisation from mid-century to the 1880s, 1890s, depending on the country. But then this wave of American grain and, you know, meat and eventually butter at the end of the century because refrigeration is coming in from Argentina. Land incomes fall and there's a protectionist backlash. You know, it starts in Germany in 1879. It starts in, you know, and there's the Méline tariff in France in 1892. You know, the Italians have been very liberal. Cavour was a real, you know, liberal kind of guy, but they shift towards protection also, and so on, you know. And so the moral of that story was that if you don't care about winners and losers, you know, well, maybe you should, because, you know, they're going to make, the losers are going to make their views heard, whether you like it or not, you know. And so we ended this book, Globalization and History, that Marvin was kind enough to reference, by saying that basically, be careful, you know, this new globalization thing that we're all talking about, you know, could end up undermining itself, because it could lead to shifts in the distribution of income that could give rise to protectionist pressures. And I feel pretty okay about having written that in 1999, I must say. Now, you know, history doesn't ever repeat itself. You know, maybe it rhymes roughly sometimes. But I mean, if you want to make the analogy stick, you would be saying something like this. You know, there's a 19th century world where the North exports manufactured goods to the underdeveloped South, and the South exports food and raw materials back to the North. And so the North, you know, there's nobody in the North that's going to lose their jobs because of importation of Malaysian rubber or, you know, that type of thing, you know. So it's kind of complementary. And this goes on for an awfully long time. So this is the share of the northern exports to the South that are manufactured goods. So we're basically exporting manufactured goods to them. This is the share of southern exports to the North that are manufactured goods. And what you can see is they're basically not exporting manufactured goods at all, you know. It's all raw materials until sometime in the 60s, you know, and you can see something ticks up, you know, but then you can see that that's the real change. And that's obvious what that is, isn't it? That's China, isn't it? Opening up, you know, and the point is that eventually these guys are going to be, you know, exporting stuff to us that we're producing. And then you end up having, you know, industry shutting down. That's when, you know, you lose your TV industry and your vacuum cleaner industry and, you know, all of this stuff. And there are people who at least potentially might be losing as a result of all of this. Now, I mean, how does this play out politically? This is some just survey evidence. You often hear people say, these working class people, in America, they just don't understand, I mean, if they'd just, gone to Trinity and learned their Adam Smith, they wouldn't be confused and they wouldn't be upset about trade. But if that logic holds true for poor people in America or Western Europe, it should presumably hold true for people in Vietnam and China also. But what you actually see is that if you ask Americans, does trade lower your wages? They say yes. If you ask the Vietnamese and the Chinese, they say no. Of course it doesn't. It's very good for us. If you ask them, does trade, raise wages? It's the opposite. Does it destroy jobs? In the West, they think it does. In the poor countries, they don't think it does. So it's the fact that these attitudes are so different across the rich country, poor country divide that is, to me, kind of most indicative of the fact that some of those economic forces that we documented for the 19th century, Heckscher-Roland forces, that they have something to say about our current predicament. So can't be unsurprised about the fact that tariffs went up. I'm not particularly surprised. This is more surprising. So what's surprising about that? So everybody looks at this and says, gosh, those are very big numbers. And I don't really care about that. What I want you to notice is that they're all different numbers, right? Because everybody got a different number, and that's illegal. You're not allowed to do that. That goes against Article 1 of the GATT. It's not Article 57 bis, it's Article 1 of the GATT. This is about as illegal as it's possible to get. It's breaking with the non-discrimination obligations that we have under international trade law. It's breaking with the most favoured nation principle, which has been the central principle governing international trade since 1945. And what I want to do for the rest of the talk is just explain to you why it was the Americans that ended up insisting on non-discrimination as the central principle governing trade, because it was very much an American ideal, and with the Europeans playing the recalcitrant would-be discriminators. So, when does the most favoured nation clause start to become? Well, it goes back to the 12th century, actually. If you are willing to look long and hard enough. But in 1860, Richard Cobden, who's a sort of a British Montesquieu, and Chevalier sign a trade treaty between the UK and France. And in it, they both agree that they're going to be each other's most favoured nation. So the Brits say to the French, you are our most favoured nation. And the French say to the British, you, my dear English, are our most favoured nation. Now, we can perhaps amuse ourselves by debating which of those two statements is, on the face of it, the more implausible. But actually, it has a technical meaning, you see. Because now we have a third country, call it Prussia. And imagine that there's some trade deal in which the French give the Prussians some concession. They lower their tariff on grain from 20% to 10%. Well, now the Prussians have got something that the British don't have. But the point is, that's now illegal, because the Brits are France's most favoured nation. So if you give the Prussians something the Brits don't have, then the Brits are no longer the most favoured nation. So what you have to do is you have to give them the same, and the Prussians, of course, gave the French something in return. But the bottom line is that the French are now obligated to give the English this tariff concession for free, because otherwise Britain would not be a most favoured nation. Okay, so it's fairly simple. The Americans never went for that. They were always more suspicious. They were all going to, they like it to drive a hard bargain, And so they always used what was called the conditional version of the most favoured nation clause. And basically the objection was, the French are giving the Brits something for free, and that seems kind of unfair. That's basically what it comes down to, And so the very first article, a trade treaty that they do is with France. And they basically, it's easier to show it to you in a graph. All right. So they say to the French, you are conditionally our most favoured nation. And the French say to the Americans, you are conditionally our most favoured nation. So what does that actually mean? So now we have the Americans doing a deal with Prussia. So they give some concession to the Prussians in return for some concession from the Prussians. Yes? And so now the question is, because France is their conditional most favoured nation, do they have to give the French what they gave the Prussians? That's the question, yes? So do they have to give them Xi, if that's what that is? And the answer is only if the French give the Americans what the Prussians had given the Americans. That's what it means, okay? That's what it means. Now, you can see that this is probably not going to be much use, because who is it that gets to decide if the French have actually given you delta? And the answer is the Americans, right? So the Americans get to decide whether this proposed compensation is equivalent or not, okay? And so, yes, the right to receive, upon the offer of equivalent compensation, concessions granted to a third party is of little practical value, because the grantor of the concessions is the judge of the equivalence. And so, yeah, Jacob Viner says that basically anytime anybody got anything out of the Americans as a result of these treaties, it was basically by accident. It was the Americans screwed up somehow, and it probably had to go to court, They did manage to drive a couple of hard bargains with the Brazilians through this period of sort of hard-edged economic diplomacy. I think 2 American presidents were forced to later apologize to the Brazilians for having done so. So they were very hard. It didn't really work. It wasn't any way to make a friend. So basically, the Europeans just said, "We're not doing any treaties with you." That's what happened. What's the point? And so everybody ends up discriminating against the Americans through one means or another. So the conditional practice, instead of operating as its supporters contended to gain specially advantageous conditions for American commerce, failed to secure for it mere equality of treatment with the commerce of other nations. So would it be that surprising to see, maybe once we've had a chance for all this to shake out 5-10 years, that maybe the Americans end up actually being discriminated against in markets around the world? Wouldn't be that surprising. We're not there yet, but that's certainly what happened in the 19th century. And so the Americans shifted to an unconditional MFN policy in 1923. So now they were no longer going to discriminate, but they were still protectionist, So they could have very, very high tariffs, but they'd just be applying equally to everybody, okay? We wanted to distinguish between protectionism and discrimination, okay? So they were protectionist but non-discriminatory. And then the point is that in the 1930s, they learned a few lessons. And those lessons convinced them that actually this non-discrimination thing is really pretty important. So the first lesson they learned came from Smoot-Hawley. I don't have time to go through all of there's too much detail on this slide. Basically, Smoot-Hawley has its roots in farmers doing poorly in the United States, and so they convince Herbert Hoover that if he wins, he'll protect them. And then there's a log rolling process where the agricultural and the industrial districts scratch each other's back, and we'll vote for your tariff if you vote for our tariff. And so anyway, tariffs go up by quite a lot. And the point is that almost immediately everybody else starts to object. Like foreigners start to object big time. So it comes in June 1930, June, okay? By the autumn, but even before it had happened, by the autumn of 1929, because people could see what was going to happen, 29 protests have been officially lodged to the State Department. And people start retaliating. Some people get their retaliation in actually before Smoot-Hawley's actually passed. Other people retaliate after it's been passed. And this is where you see national geniuses at work. So the French, for example, of course, they wouldn't dream of discriminating against anybody, but what they have is they have a tariff on cars that shifts from a value to a weight basis. Because then, as now, the Americans have big, heavy cars. And so the French market is essentially closed to them. Cars are a big target. High-tech exports are a big target, If you're going to play this kind of game, don't be surprised if your high-tech exports end up getting targeted. There was a general election fought in Canada about the issue. Actually, just before Smoot-Hawley comes in, it turns out to be a really good card in an American general election, the anti-American card. If they're threatening to do bad things to you, the person that says we're going to do bad things back, they tend to win in Canada. In those days, it was the Conservatives who were conservative, so more protectionist and also more pro-empire. And so all of that goes together. So they're going to really bash the Americans and have a closer deal with the British. Which I'll come to later. So this is what the Canadian tariff data looked like. So tariffs on American goods go up, tariffs on British goods go up, but not by very much. So there's a big increase in the margin of discrimination, right? So the Americans, they asked for it, and now they're really being discriminated against in their number 2 export market, because Canada is hugely important for the Americans. I have a paper with a couple of co-authors where we look at the impact of retaliation against Smoot-Hawley. So we have quarterly bilateral trade data. So it's a full gravity exercise, but at a quarterly level, which is kind of interesting because that means we're hoping that that's fine-grained enough along the time dimension that we can identify the impact of non-tariff shocks by timing, you know. And what this is what the US imports look like. So imports from countries that retaliated are falling. Imports from countries that don't retaliate are also falling. They look kind of similar, right? That's the American imports from these two groups, retaliators and non-retaliators. If you look at US exports, exports to non-retaliators look pretty flat. Exports to retaliators take an absolute, they really collapse. That's telling you something, you know? And, we do our regressions and put in all of the fixed effects and do the things that you're supposed to do. And the bottom line is that retaliation lowers US exports by about 30%, which is quite a big number, because that's on top of everything else that's happening, It's on top of the Great Depression, which is lowering their exports, and it's on top of any protectionism that those foreign countries are engaging in that's lowering imports from everybody equally, So this is the discriminatory impact is, lowering their exports 30%. That's a big deal. There's another approach, because that was rather aggregate. So what I've been doing a lot of, this is what Marvin was talking about, I suppose, was that, real trade policy, it doesn't involve somebody saying, let's retaliate against America. Real trade policies is let's increase the specific tariff on imports of, wheat from 2 shillings a ton to 3 shillings a ton, or that kind of stuff. That's what it actually involves. And there's different tariffs and quotas on different goods. And in the context of the interwar period where there was discrimination, there's different tariffs on the same goods from different countries. All right? And so what we've been doing is we've been collecting very detailed, fine-grained information on imports into different countries of goods. So British imports of lots and lots of goods from different countries. And we've also been collecting information on British tariffs on those imports of those different goods from different countries, And we've been seeing what all this implies for trade flows. Now, if you want to see what the impact of something is on something else, you do need a model, I'm afraid. It could be a very simple model. So let's imagine that we have, the model is a demand curve that slopes down. So the higher the price, the less of the good you import, all right? So from our trade data, we know what your imports are in 1935, and we know what the tariffs are in 1935. We know what the price was in 1935. Maybe we want to, ask, well, what was the impact of the increase in tariffs between 1929 and 1935? Well, what we can do is we can, say, well, what if that tariff had not been the 1935 tariff, but the 29 tariff? We know those two things. If we know the slope of the demand curve, then we can, tell you how much more you would have imported had the tariffs been lower. That's a very simple model, okay? Now, our data come in, they're different. So we have these very detailed data. So here we have data on, for example, woolen rags, imports into Britain of woolen rags applicable to other purposes than manurial. Very important, and we have them for, not manurial, and we have them from lots of different countries there. So that's the data that we're working with. Okay, so we've got very fine-grained data on imports of lots of different goods from lots of different countries. Okay, so rather than just one demand curve, we need something a little bit more sort of comprehensive. So I'm not going to go into details, but we essentially have a demand system. So the British importers, they have to decide, are they consuming British stuff or imports? Okay, now we're importing. Are we importing cars or wheat? Okay, we're importing wheat. Well, is it from Argentina or from Canada? And there are going to be these different margins of substitution. And presumably, if the choice between Canadian and Argentinian wheat, those things are very substitutable. And so, so if the relative price changes, there'll be a big shift in relative quantities imported. And that's the kind of thing that we can measure statistically. So we do that armed with our tariff data. So then we have basically the equivalent of the demand curve I showed you earlier. And we can see, well, what was the impact of changes in trade policy on imports from, say, America. And I mean, this is not anything we emphasized in any of these papers, but we can do it. So in Britain, for example, which is the number one destination, if you look at the impact of post-1930 policy shifts, post-1930 because they really started to protect in 1931, and then 1932, and that's also when they started to discriminate in favor of the empire. So what you can see is that in 1932, these, these tariff shifts since 1930, they're lowering US exports to Britain by almost 20%. And then it moderates a little bit. It's still 5, 6, 7%, but it's still fairly big. That's Britain. This is Canada. Now, the Canadian shift after 1930 was less dramatic than the shift in other countries because the Canadians had already been protectionist and they had already been discriminating in favour of the empire. So here what we can do is you can say, well, what if we can compare the actual trade flows in Canada with the trade flows that you would have had if Canada had had no tariffs at all. So you can look at the impact. What's the impact of the entire Canadian system of protection? And what you're finding is that it is, the entire Canadian system of protection is lowering US exports to Canada by, 15, 20%, something like that. Pretty big number, These are big, point is these are big numbers. This is Argentina. A lot of the protection in Argentina happened through exchange controls. And we've been sort of working with a proper historian, who's going into Q and so on. And she's finding that these exchange controls were managed, the Argentinian exchange controls were managed by an office in the British Embassy in Buenos Aires, which is actually very satisfying, And they are really using it to allocate foreign exchange to people who want to, to British interests rather than American interests, And again, similar sort of story. The Americans are being hit in the Argentinian market, they're being hit in the Dutch market, and so on. All right. So European discrimination, which largely had to do with empire, or in the case of Argentina, maybe informal empire, was hitting American exports severely. And the point of the next slide is this wasn't a temporary thing that just stopped in the 1930s. As we know, the Brits stayed with imperial preference all the way till when they joined the EEC, and so this is so the New Zealanders and so on would get upset periodically for fear that the British would abandon them, which of course they eventually did. But it was a very long-standing policy shift. All right, so they had every economic interest to favour non-discrimination. And then finally, and briefly, because I'm running out of time, they had geopolitical interests also. So the interwar period is a period that sees multilateral trade shifting, declining, and instead what you have is the emergence of great imperial trade blocs. So here we have the share, for example, of the British Empire in British imports. So Britain, 30% of Britain's imports are from the empire. In 1929, it goes up to 42%. And you'll see something very similar happening, for the French and so on, the Italians, it's on the export side because they've got this shiny new empire in Africa and so on. So, and the point is this was felt at the time, not just ex post, but at the time to be a dangerous thing, all right? And people worried about discrimination and they worried about what it might be doing to international political harmony, So Jacob Weiner points out that it was precisely, that he says that if you have discrimination, you have ill feeling and diplomatic bickering. Well, if you look at what's happened since Trump did what he did, who could doubt that Weiner was right about that? But it's not just ill feeling. There's other things going on as well. So Albert Hirschman had this great book that I suppose the economists are now reading, that the IR people and probably never stopped reading, on the weaponization of economic dependencies, essentially. And what he says, he says it as an empirical statement. He says, you may be export dependent on a big market. And he says, that may be very difficult to do anything about. You're exporting, whatever it is, rubber to Britain, and that's just what you're doing in the context of 1945, and you're kind of screwed. But at least you can diversify your imports, and that way the British, in this case, or whoever, will have less power over you. But then he points out that if you have a bilateral trade deals, if you want to go to bilateral trade balance, then you can't diversify your imports. If 90% of your exports are to country X, 90% of your imports have to be as well. So bilateralism is the bully's best friend, is essentially the point that he's making. And then there's another point that I've been very interested in for a long time, which is that in principle it could make it difficult to get raw materials. So imagine you have a country that is importing food and raw materials from one part of the world. And it's paying for that by exporting manufactured goods to another part of the world. And then imagine that all trade is sort of sealed off into two hermetically sealed blocks, and this is in one block and that's on the other block and so on. And you can see that might be a problem somehow. you know? And there are various authors at the time who say, well, I love the euphemism, it may adversely affect all forms of peaceful collaboration between nations. I think what he means is the invasion of Manchuria, that kind of thing, you know, or eventually Southeast Asia, you know. And to be very, you know, these people were saying this before the event, not just before the fact, not just after the fact. And this is where Cordell Hull comes in. He's FDR's Secretary of State. He's a Southern Democrat, therefore he's a free trader, because the Southerners are all free traders, right? And so initially he's in favour of free trade just for the standard free trade reasons. You know, it's good for efficiency and blah-de-blah. But eventually, around World War I, he basically says maybe trade and war have something to do with each other, you know, and maybe competitive rivalries about access to markets, access to raw materials, think of imperial scrambles and so on. Maybe that's actually not good for international peace and harmony, you know. And so if we could get a freer flow of trade, freer in the sense of fewer discriminations, I'm kind of highlighting that word, right? You know, then maybe we'd have fewer of these ill feelings that occasionally give rise to conflict. And that's what the Americans do next, you know. So after World War I, they hadn't gotten their way with the Europeans. There was a big Paris economic conference in 1916 where our friend Hewins, who wrote the preface to Alice Murray's book, was a British participant, and he was a real imperialist, and you know, he and his friends got their way. And so, you know, in the Versailles treaties, you've got these provisions according to which the Germans have got to extend most-favoured-nation clause state treatment to everybody else, but we can discriminate against the Germans, you know. There was that kind of thing going on. And it didn't work out terribly well. You know, Wilson came in and said, no, that's not a great idea, but the Europeans, they got what they wanted, you know. And the point is they didn't get their way as much after 1945. So this is the Atlantic Charter. It's an 8-point document about what the Allies are going to do after World War II. And as you can see, what they agree is that big or small, victor or vanquished, we'll all get access to the trade and raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity. Now, there is a few little weasel words up here that some of you may have noticed. The Brits got in the clause with due respect for their existing obligations, you know, and I mean, but it's clear who was on what side, you know, and basically the Americans got more of their way, you know, and that is what ends up becoming Article 1 of the GATT, which there's a lot of text there, but it's basically, if you're in the GATT or the WTO, we can't discriminate against you. Unless, you know, there's a free trade agreement or a customs union. There's a few well understood exceptions to the rule. The Europeans also got a grandfather clause for their empires, but I guess, you know, the empires were soon gone. And that was the end of that irritation for the Americans, you know. And the point I want to emphasize is that Article 1 of the GATT and the American support for non-discrimination was, I think, as much and probably more about peace and stability in the world than it was about, you know, Harburger triangles that you might have lost if you have different tariffs on imports of, you know, from different countries. It was much more about politics and, you know, not as much, I think, about economics. And so they had every interest to push for this, also economic interests. And that's, I think, why it's so surprising. You know, it's a truly historic rupture, the one that we observed. And if I could just finish a little editorial comment, and this, I'm a bit of a hothead, you know, but and I'm glad I don't have to make policy, but I don't think the European Parliament should ratify that deal with the Americans, even though the Greenland moment's over. And I don't think they should ratify it because we give the Americans zero tariffs on various goods, and we're not giving it to everybody else. And if we don't do it for everybody else, then we're breaking the rules, and that's not okay in my view. Anyway, I leave it there. Thank you very much.